just to welcome you first of all to this seminar held by CREDOC, Centre for Research into the Dynamics of Civilization, which is a research centre based here at UCL. And its ambitions are to not only open up debates and the way in which the concept of civilization has been used in the past, but particularly how it is being used in the present. Before I should go on any further, I should ask if anybody in the room requires access to BSL, British Sign Language, so that we can orientate help to anybody in the room who needs it. We know obviously one direction. Is that okay?
Perfect, thank you.
Fine. Our focus this evening is the fourth of a series of meetings that we've held this academic year on the theme of civilization. The seminars have been focused on, hopefully, rather provocative ideas, usually within the sense that they relate to problems about the way in which civilization has been used in the past, but also how increasingly it's being used again in the present. So our inaugural lecture in February by Professor Wang Mingming from Peking University in China showed only too clearly how in China at the present time the idea of civilization is both a critique of the importation of Western political and social theory into China in the 20th century, a review of all that importation, and the way in which China at the moment is exploring historically its own use of civilization, particularly within the context of Confucian philosophy and moral philosophy, and how it's being used at the present in order to, in many ways, look at the way in which diversity and unity can be expressed in a different way in contemporary China. So we're very aware of the fact that we have both a legacy of issues around the concept of civilization and the fact that it is being also used globally in new ways. And it's that connection between, if you like, the past, present and future concepts and use of civilization that we are planning and hope to address. We also are trying to meet many of the ambitions within UCL research frontiers and grand challenges, to show that our understanding of arts and humanities have much wider significance within, broadly speaking, a multi-faculty, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary context. So our first provocative seminar on the concept of progress included speakers from the biological sciences, from human evolutionary and cultural evolutionary side here in the Institute of Archaeology and in anthropology, and also with a context of discussions from history and art history. So it's trying to bridge those kind of disciplinary worlds that we're also quite concerned with. Today we're focusing on language and civilization and language, and I think you can imagine that it raises many issues, both in terms of how it has been used in the past, and language and writing obviously are complex interdigitators here, but also how it has been used both historically and in a contemporary setting. So we hope that this seminar today will open up another dimension of the way in which civilization has both historical dimensions which have very critical and crucial aspects in the contemporary world. So with that, I'll hand over to Maria, who is my co-director with the two directors of the set of CREDOC. I'll hand over to Maria Weicker, who is Professor of Greek and Latin here at UCL, whilst I'm a professor, an emeritus professor in anthropology, so you can already see, we're rather, these are not normally mixed up with each other, but we've got mixed up with each other. And I pass over to Maria to introduce the seminar and the speakers.
Thank you ever so much for coming today. At this time of year in UCL in particular, there are so many other activities going on, so we're very pleased that you were able to come to this provocation. What we're trying to achieve this afternoon is an exploration of the relationship between language and the concept of civilization, both at the level of the history of scholarship on languages and in their everyday use, both in the past and in the present. We want to think about how language, as distinct from literacy or literature, has shaped categories of race, ethnicity, or ability. We're interested in how hierarchies of language have been constructed and made to bear on hierarchies of civilization. What we would like to do is have each of our 4 speakers come and talk for about 15 minutes on the particular perspective from which they're looking at language and civilization, and then we will open up to discussion amongst us all. There is also, I should say, a reception afterwards in the Institute of Archaeology Common Room, and we see the reception as an important part of CREDOC activities because it's very important to us that colleagues from different disciplines should be able to speak to each other about these core issues that we're trying to address.
The next 3 speakers will be talking about sort of uncanonical languages and uncanonical forms of communication. So we're going to start with the canon par excellence, which is Greek and Latin, the classics. Okay. Right, okay. Our Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, wants to take the class out of classics, which is great if he can do that. I guess what he means is he wants Greek and Latin to be taught more widely in the state sector. That's great if he can pull that off. He's going to have trouble taking the class out of classics because class has been built into classics since at least 300 BC, meaning since the end of the Greek classical period, essentially. I'm going to suggest that the class in classics, in fact, is what led to our idea of grammar and the notion of grammatical and grammaticality. And so it's rather difficult to get the class out unless you're prepared to abandon the idea of grammaticality that we function with in our society. And I assume that the way we function is actually dysfunctional. We have a dysfunctional attitude to language in our culture, and that goes right back to Greek and Latin, to classics. There are many benefits of Greek and Latin. The downside is we don't have a good relationship, I think, with language. Or rather, we're confused about the relationship between spoken and written language. Right, okay, the Greeks then borrowed the alphabet from the Phoenicians sometime between 1000, probably 900 BC. The Greeks had no problem with this. They were very happy with this, and they talked about it quite a lot. They even called, for example, a scribe could be called someone who does Phoenician things. In the 19th century, Europeans had a greater problem with this because it was disconcerting that this great thing, alphabetic literacy, had come from a Semitic people. We really wanted it to be an Indo-European thing. The Greeks are Indo-Europeans, if you like. They speak an Indo-European language. We have a conflation of language and race. And as Indo-Europeans, if you like, we want the alphabet to be an Indo-European invention. So 19th century, you get the idea that, in fact, the Phoenicians didn't really have an alphabet. They had a sort of stunted writing system because it doesn't write vowels very much. Okay, just like Arabic and Hebrew these days don't write vowels very much, and if you know Arabic or Hebrew, you'll understand why. Morphologically, they're very different from Indo-European. You don't have to write them. And human beings are lazy. You don't do what you don't have to do. So the idea is that the Greeks took over this sort of stunted thing from the Phoenicians, and in a stroke of sort of Aryan brilliance, added vowels. Well, it seems to me to be a sensible step. I wouldn't call it a stroke of brilliance. I wouldn't say the Greeks invented the alphabet. They adopted a technology, and they were very frank about it. They took a technology from the Phoenicians, and they adapted it to Greek, where it is quite handy to have vowels. Now, there had been literate before, actually, in the Mycenaean period. They borrowed a writing system from the Minoans. It's a very inconvenient writing system. It's syllabic and not very good for writing Greek. Here you go. This is a tablet which lists olive oil being sent to gods. It says 2 Dictaean Zeus, 1 measure of olive oil. They forgot about that after the collapse of Mycenaean civilization in 1200, and they forgot they'd been literate, and they had to start again, sometime after 1000 BC. Anyway, that's pedantry, not relevant to what I want to talk about today. Now, yes, there's the line. Right. Right. Okay. The Greeks actually, during the classical period, were unworried by diversity in language. In fact, there's no such language as ancient Greek, as you probably know. There is simply a range of Greek dialects. There's no common language. They all spoke different dialects. They didn't have a problem with that, which is interesting because the Romans and us, we are worried by diversity in language. We don't, on the whole, like it. We want a fairly homogeneous language. Now, this started to change in the classical period. After the Greeks had defeated the Persians in 490 BC and then again in 480 BC, miraculously, they never quite got over their surprise at doing this, things started to change. So the word barbarian is borrowed from Greek. The Greek word is barbaros. This actually comes from the Greek attempt to represent a foreign language, which is bar, 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 bar. That is, to the Greeks, what a foreign language sounds like. That simply gives you the word barbaros. And it's not pejorative in the classical period. It simply means a foreigner, one who doesn't speak Greek. In the classical period, this critical period, 490 to 320, a number of important things happen. The term barbarian starts to become pejorative. Literacy takes off. I mean, it's not that the whole population was literate, but during the classical period, large numbers of people are literate who were not literate before, and prose becomes the norm. Before the classical period, Greece was a society really where poetry was at the heart of literary production. In the classical period, it's prose, and this seems to me to be critical. Once you think that prose is normal, a number of things follow from that. In particular, you start to think that you speak in prose. We don't speak in prose, but I think probably most people in Britain today think that we speak in prose. So you conflate spoken language and prose, and you regard poetry as somewhat exotic. You don't mistake poetry in normal language. And, technical term, you get the start of diglossia. Diglossia is what happens when a society becomes literate, because literacy is conservative. When you start to write, you don't change the way you spell. You don't change the way you write. It's frozen, it's fossilized, but the language keeps changing. Diglossia means you're speaking two languages as a community. You've got a formal written language, which you use in education, the elite use it in formal situations. And you've got the language as it's developing, which is the live, living language. And gradually the gulf between them becomes so wide that you can't actually manipulate the posh version without an education. So right now in English, we're just dipping our toe, I think, into the water of diglossia. In a little while, maybe we'll become fully diglossic. At the moment, the written formal standard is quite a bit different from the way most people talk most of the time, but not so different yet for most of us, depending on how educated you are, what kind of social background you come from. So here we go, diglossia. Two forms of language, high and low, that's posh and normal, if you like. And here we go. The use of writing leads to the belief that the written language is the real language, and that speech is a corruption. This is nearly universal. And this is, I think, what the classics have given us. After the classical period, the Greeks didn't think this, I think, during most of the classical period, towards the end, and after, when they start to look back to this golden age of great literature, then I think we get this, and we haven't managed to get rid of it. So there is diglossia. Okay, I've got some silly. you've got a continuum. Okay, so for example, Latin in medieval Europe, it's a high. You've got a continuum then between Latin and Proto-French, Proto-Portuguese, Proto-Catalan, and everything else. Yeah, so give three places. Yeah. So probably by the time of the fall of Pompeii, 79 BC, the destruction of Pompeii, the word for horse, okay, equus in classical Latin, the written language is probably something like cavallo in spoken Latin across the empire. That gives you the word cheval in French and all the other languages. Panis would be pane. And gradually, the languages start to diverge. So this leads to the daughter languages of Latin. A disobliging question: when did Latin turn into Italian? Well, maybe it was the 2nd of June, 863. You know, well, of course, it's a stupid question. It's not a linguistic question. It's a political question. Latin turned into Italian when the Italians decided to call what they were speaking Italian and not Latin, right? So we speak of modern Greek and ancient Greek. We don't speak of modern Latin and ancient Latin. That's a naming decision, right? Latin never turned into Italian. If you want, it's still Latin. It's called Italian in Italy. If you have an Italian passport, you regard yourself as an Italian speaker and so on and so forth. These are political, social things, not linguistic things. Right, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
So the Romans then borrowed the alphabet from the Greeks around 700. They didn't bother to write very much, having borrowed it, till about 300 BC, when they ran into the Greeks in the south of Italy, because the south of Italy was colonized by Greeks, south of Italy and Sicily. And the Romans took over, all these huge forms of Greek civilization: architecture, literature, literacy. The Greeks by then were diglossic. So when the Romans took the alphabet from the Greeks, they took over a lot of baggage with it, right? They took over essentially the idea that a good language is diglossic. You need two forms of the language, and you don't have diversity. And Latin does not tolerate diversity. We have no dialects of Latin. There must have been dialects of Latin. They're squashed. The Romans are diglossic from really the start, simply because they take this from the Greeks as part of a package with the technology of writing, okay? It's not just a technology. Writing is a package of cultural stuff. Yeah, okay, and this is grammar. Okay, okay. Let's see, grammar. Okay, grammar grows out of this tradition, that classical tradition. It's designed for elite education. What's the point in grammar? The point is to get the offspring of the elite to learn the classics. So the point of grammar is to help them read text and language, which is now very far away from the spoken language. So if you want to read Homer in 100 BC, you need a grammar, because Homer is 600 years old already. Right? If you want to read Cicero in 400 AD, you need a grammar. The point of grammar is to explicate the classical canon. And this leads to the chilling dead hand of correctness. The idea that there's correct language and incorrect language. Correct language is the language of the canon, what you're trying to achieve by education. A native speaker, it follows. A native speaker can be ungrammatical. In fact, most native speakers are ungrammatical most of the time, because that's the point of an expensive education. You mark yourself off by being grammatical. So I'll ask you the question: does it make sense to say that a native speaker can ever be ungrammatical? I'm going to argue, my idea is it makes no sense. A foreigner can be ungrammatical, a child can be ungrammatical, a native speaker who is compos mentis, what kind of thing is it to say that they are ungrammatical, right? It means, I suppose, they're not speaking the literary language of the elite. They're speaking a variety which is not canonical. So that's, I think, where our grammaticality comes from. Right, okay. So grammar in civilization is a very big heading. Okay, so a good language has laws. Like a good, well-ordered society has laws, grammar has laws. like the rule of law, a very explicit parallel there. Okay, languages which aren't codified, they are not civilized. You know, they're chaotic, anarchic. Okay, right. A canon of texts. If you haven't got a canon of text to rely on, your language is just a patois, right? Not civilized. An education designed by and for the elite. Your language has to be underpinned by this complicated educational system. Let's see. You have correct and incorrect language. That grows out of prose. I really, blame prose for all of this, I think. The idea that written prose is correct speech. What I'm saying now is an attempt at written prose. But when you're talking with your friends in the pub, that is incorrect. Finally, a confusion of language and race. Because, for example, when the French rename Latin French, they decide that they're speaking French. It follows that to speak French marks you off as a French person. Right? Therefore, all French people speak French. You get race and language becoming intertwined. Now, this might not seem so sinister, but it can be, because language and Latin and Greek, for example, are related. They have a common parent, which is called Indo-European, because it was discovered in India and Europe in the late 18th, early 19th century. So here we go. These words are clearly related. Here's the English word, related, in the right-hand column. If there was a language called Indo-European, there must have been a race. The Indo-Europeans, there must have been a people, right? Well, hang on a minute. Not all people who speak English are English, but somehow we want to say all people who spoke Indo-European were Indo-Europeans, and this is where we get to this 19th century conflation of language and race, which has, of course, grave social implications. Right, here is a modern map of Indo-European languages, and so one starts to hunt around on the map. Where did the original Indo-European people live? You're starting to mix up language and race. So that is, I think, where I'll stop. Latin and Greek are the canonical language. All languages in Europe, after Latin and Greek, modelled themselves on Latin and Greek, not just in a trivial way, but they also modelled notions of correctness and grammaticality on the package that they'd inherited from their classical world. And that is why I think it's really quite difficult to take the class out of classics. I do think it's great to have Latin and Greek taught, to all students who want to learn Latin and Greek at all stages of the curriculum. But class is really embedded, I think, in the classics. Right, thank you very much.
Stephen, I was forced to do classics at school. I'm still recovering from having had that done. Thank you, Maria. First slide, please, dear. Today, I'm going to talk today about a quite explicit claim that was made in the middle of the 19th century regarding language and civilization in the context of Africa, which is my specialism. I teach and research Hausa, which is the principal language of northern Nigeria and southern Niger, in the news increasingly these days for the wrong reasons. And I've also researched Nilo-Saharan languages in the area of Lake Chad as well, so that's my specialism. The claim was quite explicit. It related a feature of all languages, a widespread linguistic feature, with civilization. This is set against the background of some very negative pseudo-scientific assumptions about language and civilization, which permeated not just linguistics but also anthropology and history. Put my glasses on now. The mid-19th century saw the emergence of linguistics as a science, the study of languages, but not all studies are scientific by any means. Language features, language phenomena were confused and misused, and there were some really egregious, gross, serious methodological errors made. For example, the misuse of the typological feature of, next slide please, grammatical gender. Next one please, Maria. Grammatical gender, what do I mean by this? I mean, I'm sure you all know in fact, but let's just have some transparent examples. German has a three-way contrast in the definite article, masculine, feminine and neuter, der, die, das, depending upon the noun. Notice there's no contrast in English, it's just invariant the. Hausa, the principal language of northern Nigeria, the one I specialise in, has a two-way contrast in the definite article. It's a suffix in Hausa. So Watang, the N is the month and the R indicates feminine, so a two-way distinction. Now, from about the 1850s onwards, there was an obsession, a neuro-obsession with grammatical gender as a putative marker of the genetic unity of language families. Okay, why is this a problem? Yeah. It's a problem because grammatical gender is not a valid marker of genetic unity or language family membership. It's a typological, not a genetic feature. And I have an analogy here with birds, bats and bees in this classification. There are some classicists in the audience, probably know more about this than I do, but I think in ancient Greece, the scientists, or in Greece, early Greece, the scientists attempted a taxonomic classification of all animals or phenomena, and they decided that birds, bats and bees were in the same species on the basis of the fact that they had the power of flight. Okay. We know they're not the same species now, but that was a functional typological categorization that they thought was correct, but has been proved to be incorrect. Okay. Now, if you were doing German and Hausa and English, comparing them, for example, and you use the typological feature of grammatical gender to try and come up with some kind of genetic classification, you'd end up grouping German and Hausa together in one group and excluding English, which you probably wouldn't want to do. But that's the problem with the typological analysis. There are lots of tone languages in Africa. Out of 2,000 sub-Saharan African languages, the vast majority have tonal contrasts. Okay, there are tone languages in East Asia. There are tone languages in Mexico. But you wouldn't want to classify the languages of sub-Saharan Africa together with East Asia and Mexico as representing a single group. No sane, responsible linguist would want to do that. Consequences would be rather negative. Next one, please, Maria. Okay, but the claim about grammatical gender and civilization embodied a more sinister, negative element to it, which was, okay, this is the hypothesis from about the 1850s onwards. It was an X, then Y interpredictability. There's a correlation between the use or presence of grammatical gender in language and the mental capacity of the speakers. So if a language had grammatical gender, speakers, culture were civilized. If it didn't, then the speakers and culture were uncivilized. Okay, this was the basic gender correlate that was suggested, correlating with superior mental capacity, genetic biological superiority. Okay. Well, which peoples or languages suffered most on this view of the world? Well, guess what? Okay, next one, Africa. Of course, where language almost certainly originated. It's especially ironic, given the conventional view among scientists that we all trace our ancestry back to anatomically modern humans who emerged in Africa maybe 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens. And that language as a unique and decisive innovation probably has existed on the continent for longer than anywhere else in the world. A vast time frame. Those are the four major African language families, phylogenetic classification. This is Afroasiatic, which goes into Southeast Asia, of course, here, with the Semitic languages. Nilo-Saharan here, Kanuri, Sudanic languages, Nubian, Maasai here. Niger-Congo, this massive family, all the way from Fulani right into the bottom half of the continent, which includes the Bantu subfamily here in brown, and finally Khoisan, formerly Hottentot Bushmen. So it's a massively complex area. Yeah. Next one, please, Maria. Surely this ludicrous notion was strangled at birth. Well, no, it wasn't strangled at birth, unfortunately. Just in case you think it should have been, it wasn't. as late as 1966, when I was an undergraduate at LSE, and so I was doing anthropology, Seligman's text, this was a reprint of an earlier book called The Races of Africa, quoted in Newman, said the following: the civilizations of Africa are the civilization of the Hamites, quicker witted than the dark agricultural Negroes. Okay, this is 1966, so it's relatively recent. This nonsense was still being peddled. Okay, why wasn't it strangled at birth? It has to do with the Hamitic myth, I think, partly. Yeah. It's because it fed into the prevailing pseudoscience, which embraced the now discredited Hamitic hypothesis. It added legitimate, linguistic legitimacy to the concept of a Hamitic race, Caucasian, inherently superior to sub-Saharan black African populations. Okay. So it fed into this Hamitic hypothesis. Yeah, next one. So who peddled it? Okay, answer. One of the principal proponents was Karlik Lepsius. He was an Egyptologist, and linguist, or philologist, as they were named in those days. He worked on Nubian, which is a Nilo-Saharan language of Sudan. He devised a universal phonetic alphabet, which is quite useful, called the Standard Alphabet, in 1863. And he worked on the classification of African languages. Yeah, next one. This is actually from his book now, 1863, the Standard Alphabet. You can see there he's got his basic cut is literary versus illiterate, he calls them, literary languages. But he's also got gender in there as a major factor. Gender languages, he has three groups: Japhetic, which was his name for Indo-European, as Indo-Germanica was, as it was at the time, Semitic, we all know, and Hamitic, this non-existent, in fact, family. All these names come from the Bible, so it has biblical legitimacy as well. You've got Shem, I think it was Shem, Ham, and Japheth was the third son, I think, of Noah, I believe, yeah. So it gave it kind of biblical significance and legitimacy. So this wasn't accidental. So, but the Japhetic is the Indo-Europeans like that. And so-called primitive or South African, isolated or Middle African, were right down the bottom there. Don't to the bottom. Illiterate and primitive. Yeah, that's his basic cut. Yeah, next one, please. Maria. This is the wording. It is not accidental, but very significant that, as far as I know, without any essential exception, only the most highly civilized races, the leading nations in the history of mankind, distinguish throughout the genders. The distinction not only of the masculine and feminine, as in the Semitic, Hamitic languages, and so on and so on. Okay. That's verbatim from Lepsius, 1863. Yeah, thanks, Maria. And he continues breathtakingly. It seems, however, unquestionable that the three branches of gender languages were not only in the past the depositories and the organs of the historical progress of human civilization, to them belong also the future hopes of the world. It's splendid stuff, isn't it? It's a heady mix. Okay. Again, from Lepsius, 1863. Thank you. Okay. The hypothesis essentially states that if you have the good fortune to speak a language which distinguishes grammatical gender, and by definition you belong to a highly civilized society and culture, and such civilizations together hold the future of the world in their hands. Nice. Okay. On the other hand, if you're unlucky enough to be born into a community speaking language without grammatical gender, then presumably you're doomed to live your life as an uncivilized barbarian, hapless and hopeless. Okay. If your language is simple or impoverished, no grammatical gender, then you are simple and impoverished by definition. Yeah, thanks. Lepsius wasn't the only European signed up to this scientific racism. John Speke, in 1863, Speke was famous for accompanying Richard Burton to the source of the Nile in the 1850s. They both thought of it, but That was John Speake. And in his journals, he writes about the civilized North Africa versus the barbaric Central Africa. Yeah, picture of Speake there. Yeah, next one. And Wilhelm Bleek, a member of the audience knows much more about him than I do. 1862. Now Bleek had worked on Bantu and I believe Khoi San languages in southern Africa. Yeah. And he writes, 1862, about the same time, the nations speaking sex-denoting languages, i.e. with grammatical gender, are distinguished by a higher poetical conception, whatever the hell it means by that. This faculty is not developed in the Kaffir mind. Kaffir is a derogatory term for South African black. Yeah. And there's a picture of Bleek. Next one. I couldn't resist. Yeah. Who was who? They're basically interchangeable. They've got the same hairstylist. Bleek and Speak. Their names rhyme. Bleek and Speak. Okay. I don't know which one is which. They got the same beard. Yeah. Can you tell them apart? That's me. Private eye joke or something like that. Anyway, Bleek and Speak. There they are. We'll see. It was quite ironic that Bleek should be so make such a derogatory, negative remark about Bantu languages, given the fact that, as we shall see, they are quite complex in reality. Yeah, next one, please. Now, the hypothesis is obviously and easily falsifiable. All you have to do is demonstrate that there are languages without gender, with speakers or cultures just as civilized as people speaking gender languages. And we'll have evidence from a well-known Indo-European language fairly shortly. And or there are languages, for example African, without masculine and feminine gender, so defined as inferior or uncivilized, but in reality presenting highly complex agreement patterns equivalent to genders. Yeah, next one please. And if I can, with your indulgence, resort to a phrase from a very civilized language, Latin, and reductio ad absurdum, press this argument as far as we can, okay? And with apologies to all you 300 million mother tongue speakers of English out there. Okay, apologies in advance. Right. Next one, please. Okay. English doesn't have grammatical gender. If we take a longitudinal look at English, on Lepsis's weird view of the world, speakers of English must have experienced a gradual deterioration of mental faculties, erosion of cognitive competence. Okay, I mean, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, but I'm trying to get the point across. But how on earth did this happen? Yeah, next one. Well, what must have happened? This must be the story, the fairy story. Okay. English underwent major morphological simplification. We know that, that's a fact. Specifically, the gradual loss of three-way grammatical gender. It was distinguished in Old English, but on its way out by the 10th century, 11th century. So the inherited der, die, das contrast simplified or neutralized and went to the, okay? With concomitant decivilization, I've called it, okay? Now, next one, please. Okay. And what we have to do now is show that there are languages with no grammatical gender as defined for Indo-European, but with complex agreement systems. Bantu languages, Africa, yeah, Swahili, Zulu, Luganda, and so on. They cover the 2/3 of the bottom part of the continent. They have very, very complex and highly sophisticated noun class systems, gender-like agreement patterns based on contrasts such as human, non-human, animate, inanimate, square, round, oblong, and so on. Sometimes numbering as many as 15 or 20 noun classes. Very complex, okay? For example, in Zulu, these are the class 2 Concord agreement prefixes for humans, okay? You've got, on the head word, children, you've got the aba prefix, and then the his is ba, and the small is aba, and then on the prefix on drink is ba. They're all class 2, okay? His small children drink milk, okay? So quite complex, okay? These are like gender systems. They're not masculine and feminine. They're sophisticated NP marking systems, okay? It's interesting that Bleek obviously didn't realise that there was a conflict here between saying that, you know, the Kaffir mind is not quite capable of these sophisticated operations, And yet he was dealing with Bantu languages which had immensely complicated, sophisticated noun-class marking systems. So much for Bleak's underdeveloped, uncivilized Kaffir mind. Okay, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Jewish civilization in Eastern Europe, which flourished from at least the early medieval period until the Second World War, reflects a really interesting and unusual type of diglossia. So the native vernacular was Yiddish, an Indo-European, specifically Germanic language. The origins of Yiddish are a bit obscure and debated, but a widely accepted hypothesis is that Yiddish emerged around 1000 CE in Central Europe, when Jews migrated from Romance-speaking regions, so France and Italy, and settled in possibly in the Rhineland and adopted the local Germanic dialects and created a kind of fusion language which had Romance and Germanic and then also some Semitic elements. And then that this language spread with Jewish migration into Eastern Europe over the next few centuries, where it took on a Slavic component as well. So Yiddish in Eastern Europe has always represented a fusion of Germanic, Hebrew, Aramaic. Aramaic is a sister language to Hebrew, and Slavic elements. And it's written in the Hebrew alphabet, with some adaptations. Chiefly, as befitting an Indo-European language, it has vowels. But the main language of written prestige among Jews in Eastern Europe wasn't Yiddish, it was Hebrew. So in contrast to Yiddish, Hebrew isn't an Indo-European language, it's Semitic. And it has a very long history that's quite different to the history of Yiddish in many ways. It was the original spoken language of the biblical Israelites and the primary language of composition of the Hebrew Bible. But it probably died out as a vernacular in around 200 CE, when it was replaced by Aramaic. Nevertheless, it was immortalized and kind of had an afterlife after it wasn't a spoken language anymore, not only as the language of the Bible, but also the language of the Mishnah, which is the primary compendium of Jewish oral law that represents a different type of Hebrew, which I'll talk about a bit more later. And it was also the language of much of Jewish liturgy, which was composed over the next few centuries and into the medieval period. And in fact, it continued to be used as a language of written composition among Jews as they migrated throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and into Europe. And throughout the whole of the medieval period, Hebrew was used for composing diverse genres, including liturgical poetry, secular poetry, scientific texts, philosophy, epics, Jewish legal writing. Really all kinds of things were composed in Hebrew, so it was very much a living language, even though it wasn't a spoken language. So in Eastern Europe, you have this very interesting situation where Yiddish, which was the main spoken language, wasn't really appreciated. It was generally seen as vastly inferior to Hebrew, which wasn't actually spoken, but had this very long and venerable written tradition going back to the Hebrew Bible, which was obviously the kind of founding text, and then the Mishnah, which was sort of the Bible and the Mishnah together sort of formed the basis of rabbinic Judaism. So Yiddish was referred to by its own speakers in all kinds of derogatory ways that reflect this perception of its low status. It was often called jargon, and it was described as a Dienstmädel, a maidservant of Hebrew. It was seen as a corrupt and degenerate variety of German. And crucially, following on from what Stephen was saying, it was believed that Yiddish didn't have grammar. So Yiddish grammar is actually, it's similar to German grammar. It's not the same as German, but for example, it has 3 genders, der, die, das. Some dialects have 2, but this perception is that it's like it's not real. It doesn't really have grammar. It's not a proper language. And this is even more interesting because Yiddish was actually also used as a language of writing. So as I mentioned, it's written in the Hebrew alphabet, and it has a very rich literature dating back to the medieval period. So, like Hebrew, Yiddish texts span a wide range of genres. So, Yiddish compositions from the medieval period include some biblical commentaries, travelogues, adaptations of European epics, scientific texts, medical texts, poetry, and others. So it is itself heir to a very rich literary tradition, but nevertheless, these writings didn't usually have the prestige of their Hebrew counterparts among Yiddish speakers. And actually, throughout this period and kind of into the early modern period, Yiddish texts were often labeled as being for women or for men who are like women. And this is because women didn't usually learn enough Hebrew to be able to read a Hebrew text. They were often literators, and they could read the prayer book, but they might not understand what they were reading. And likewise, men who didn't have a high level of Jewish education were like women in that respect. So one example of this traditional attitude is the Hasidic Hebrew tale genre. And then this is a body of writing that emerged in the early 19th century. And it grew into a very popular genre by the second half of the 19th century in Eastern Europe. And the tales were hagiographic stories that were written by adherents of the Hasidic spiritual movement, which is a sort of a spiritual movement that evolved among Jews of Eastern Europe in this period. And it centers on the figure of the Rebbe, who is a kind of a charismatic sort of guru-type leader. And the Hasidic Hebrew tales, so that they were told about the Rebbes and like kind of their wonders and their works and their lives and the sort of adventures of their followers. And these tales were all passed down orally in Yiddish. But when they were committed to writing, they were almost always translated into Hebrew, because that was what you did. If you had something that was worthy of being written down, you should really write it in Hebrew if you wanted people to take it seriously. So this was kind of the situation that existed kind of until the 19th century, when something happened that kind of changed this trajectory. So the late 18th century saw the beginning of a movement that would have a really profound influence on the development of both Hebrew and Yiddish over the course of at least the next 100 years. And so that's the period that I'm going to be focusing on from now on. This movement is called the Haskalah, or the Haskole in Yiddish, the Jewish Enlightenment. The Haskalah started in Berlin in the 1780s when Jews were first given civil rights. And it promoted the idea of increased Jewish integration into non-Jewish society. So this included the study of subjects that weren't part of the curriculum in the traditional Jewish educational system, so things like math, science, and non-Jewish languages. So this is interesting because I just mentioned before that in the medieval period you had mathematical texts and scientific texts and things like this written in both Hebrew and Yiddish. But really by the 19th century, generally the Jewish society was very much focused on the traditional Jewish educational system, which concentrated on the study of Jewish texts, starting with the Torah and liturgy, and then moving on to the Talmud, which was the sole focus at the higher levels. So over the course of the 19th century, the Haskalah spread eastward from Berlin into Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then into Tsarist Russia. And this newfound interest in non-Jewish education led to an intensification or a sort of new dimension to this traditional disdain for Yiddish, because it incorporated some language perceptions that were coming from non-Jewish society. So first of all, there was a long-standing tradition of study and respect for Hebrew among Europeans, non-Jewish Europeans, specifically biblical Hebrew, obviously because of the prestigious status of the Bible. And this, I think, reinforced the traditional Jewish veneration for Hebrew as Lashon HaKodesh, or in Yiddish, Lashon Kodesh, the holy tongue. So it kind of, the European sort of educational structures that the Maskilim, the adherents of the Jewish Enlightenment, were sort of trying to emulate, sort of also said, like, biblical Hebrew is a prestigious language that's worthy of study. And then secondly, one of the ideas of the Haskalah was that Jews should stop speaking Yiddish because obviously, there'd always been this idea that Yiddish wasn't really that great of a language or a proper language. And with this kind of drive to sort of integrate somewhat into European society, that there was this idea that Jews should adopt one of the prestigious European languages as their vernacular instead of Yiddish, so typically either German or Russian. And I think because Yiddish and German are related languages, this sort of newfound comparison with German inevitably heightened the idea that Yiddish is just a corrupt version of that language, because if you compare the grammars, you'll see that they're not the same, and so anything that is different in Yiddish than in German must be not as good. So another part of the Haskalah project involved the creation of a modern Jewish literature. So this included novels, short stories, and drama. And these were all genres that hadn't really existed as such among Central and Eastern European Jews previously. So, what language did the masculine choose for this endeavor? Obviously Hebrew, because in this kind of diglossic state, they were used to the idea of having one spoken language and one written language. So they were very comfortable with the idea that Jews should kind of give up Yiddish, start speaking Russian or German, but they should continue to write in Hebrew. And they thought that they were happy with that solution. They thought that that could continue. And they didn't just pick any kind of Hebrew. They specifically picked biblical Hebrew for this. So this choice is a really interesting example of varying sort of perceptions of prestige within a single language. The Maskilim regarded biblical Hebrew as the purest, most elevated form of the language, partly because it brought to mind a time when the Jews were a strong, independent nation, and partly, as I mentioned, because of the prestige with which it was regarded in non-Jewish society. Okay, but by contrast, they looked down on post-biblical forms of Hebrew. So, for example, the language of the Mishnah and the language of other rabbinic writings. And this was partly because they associated these forms of the language with the rabbinic establishment of their day, which they saw as an obstacle to the Jews' enlightenment and integration. And it was also associated with Yiddish. So they associated post-biblical forms of Hebrew with Yiddish. And this was due to the fact that a lot of the Hebrew component of Yiddish comes from post-biblical varieties of the language. And the Hebrew component in Yiddish is quite substantial. It accounts for around 20% of the language's vocabulary. So they kind of saw post-biblical rabbinic Hebrew as sort of intimately linked with Yiddish, which obviously they thought was inferior. And at the same time, it didn't have the prestige of biblical Hebrew, which sort of already existed in Europe at the time. So as the Haskalah spread eastward into Tsarist Russia in the second half of the 19th century, it led to the emergence of a very rich flourishing of new literature in Hebrew, both original literature and translated. So this includes, as I mentioned, novels and short stories. And most of these were about various aspects of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. They were usually about things like intergenerational conflict and the struggles of Maskilim to spread the Enlightenment and their sort of noble fights against the corrupt Hasidim, because this was one of their main issues, was that they really hated the Hasidic movement and they thought that it was backwards. And obviously Hasidim spoke Yiddish and they didn't like that. So they also wrote on some historical topics and they wrote plays, and then they translated classics of European literature, including, for example, Shakespeare and Goethe, as well as Josephus and other more ancient writers. So the motivation for them to develop this literature was only partly aesthetic, but it was also didactic, because the Maskilim wanted to educate the, as they saw it, the uneducated Jewish masses in Eastern Europe about the Haskalah, and they wanted to spread the cause of enlightenment among them. So, as I said, their goals were to promote secular learning, convince the Jews to abandon Hasidism, and of course to get them to abandon Yiddish as their vernacular. And this is really clearly reflected in their writing. So, but as this went on, the Maskilic authors kind of started to grow increasingly frustrated that their efforts weren't really having the desired effect. In many cases, they were writing for a relatively closed circle of other Maskilim, because these stubborn, uneducated Jewish masses that they were trying to reach couldn't read enough Hebrew to appreciate their works. So some of these authors started writing in Yiddish, And they really did this kind of begrudgingly, in most cases, like against their own will and apologetically, because they're supposed to be sort of respected authors writing fine literature, and they didn't see Yiddish as a proper language that was worthy of this sort of thing. But almost immediately, they discovered, to their great surprise, that they could achieve through Yiddish what they had never been able to achieve through Hebrew, as their novels and short stories very quickly became bestsellers, and they were widely read and loved by Jews throughout Eastern Europe. And as this happened, they were shocked to discover that, contrary to their expectations, this lowly jargon, the language without any grammar, was actually capable of expressing everything that they wanted to, and it really served very well as a literary language, and was actually, in many cases, much easier and more flexible to write in than Hebrew, because obviously Hebrew, not being a native language, had some major problems. If you're trying to write about contemporary society, it had huge gaps in vocabulary, which they had very inventive ways of getting round, and they created a lot of neologisms, but nevertheless, it wasn't as easy as writing in the language which you actually spoke and thought in. So Yiddish literature was born almost overnight, and very quickly it came to have a trio of classic writers, even with a grandfather, and then there were the three classic writers were almost kind of 20 years apart the most, but there was a grandfather among them. So Yiddish literature became very quickly, became quite established. And when this happened, this kind of led to another interesting development. It led to a kind of perceptual shift among many Yiddish speakers who started to kind of recognize that maybe Yiddish was a language that was worthy in its own right, and it wasn't just a kind of inferior dialect, and that it should have some kind of status as a Jewish language. So sort of from the late 19th century onwards, much of Jewish Eastern Europe spread into two linguistic camps, the Hebraeus and the Yiddishists. And there was some kind of overlap, and it wasn't completely sort of cut and dry, but there sort of were these two main camps. And due to time constraints, I can't go into all the details of this now, but I'll just highlight a pivotal moment that's really kind of emblematic of the whole issue, which is the Czernowitz Conference of 1908. So this is a conference that was held in Czernowitz in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and its aims were to discuss the status of Yiddish and to determine what the Jewish national language should be. So just as a concept, this is really interesting that such a conference was decided that this was important enough to hold this and have a debate about it. And I'm sorry I can't go into more details about it now, but just to give you something of an idea, there were extremely bitter, passionate arguments between the delegates. So there were some who thought that Hebrew should be the only Jewish national language, and then some that thought that Hebrew's time had ended and it was just kind of an old-fashioned written language, and it wasn't really fit for use in the modern world. This was kind of overlapping with the beginning of the revernacularization of Hebrew in Palestine, which started in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, but it wasn't still completely established by this point. So there were some who said, Hebrew, its time has passed, it should just gracefully pass the mantle on to Yiddish, which is its rightful heir. And there was, again, this kind of anthropomorphic talk that's, Hebrew is the grandmother, and it just has to accept the fact that, it has to move on and has to kind of hand the keys over to its granddaughter. And in the end, a kind of compromise was reached whereby it was agreed that Yiddish should be considered a national language, not the national language, but a national language of the Jews. And this title kind of helped to do something to sort of give it some kind of status. So just as a postscript, 100 years later, what's the outcome of all of this? So just on one foot, as the expression goes in Hebrew and Yiddish, Hebrew obviously was successfully revernacularized and became the national language of the state of Israel and has millions of native speakers and is used in all walks of life. Whereas due to various factors, including chiefly the Holocaust and widespread immigration, Yiddish has become an endangered minority language with no geographical center and barely any official status anywhere in the world. But it still has a sizable bank of native speakers, particularly in the ultra-Orthodox communities where it has a good rate of transmission to children. And in the last 20 years or so, it's become the subject of renewed interest and popularity. So despite the lingering existence of the old stereotypes, such as students being surprised that Yiddish can be studied at university because it doesn't have grammar, it's becoming increasingly recognized and valued as a vital key to Eastern European Jewish identity. So in spite of everything, the last chapter in the intertwined story of Hebrew and Yiddish hasn't been written yet.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come today. Perfect. So I'll talk a little bit over the history of British Sign Language, its history and social context. And also I want to mention some of the historical attitudes that we see in terms of sign language, cultural manifestations, and deaf people and sign languages we now see in the mainstream. And I'll include a little bit of an advert about how BSL is now something that's happening at UCL, and have some thoughts on the future of sign languages too. So probably worth starting out with some of the myths about sign languages. People often think that there's a single universal sign language, and I regret to inform you that there isn't. People often then say, but why isn't there one across the whole of the world? And I always say, well, I'm waiting for hearing people to come together, get your act together, and decide which will be the single global language, and then we'll sort ourselves out. There's also a myth that sign language basically consists of iconic gestures. And of course, there is a role of iconicity in sign languages. We see signs like book or tree, where we can clearly identify iconic motivations, but brother and sister, for example, look nothing like brothers or sisters. So although there is some iconic role in sign language as there are in spoken languages, it's not the only mechanism for generating language. People often think that sign languages were invented by hearing people to help deaf people. But we know from some of the historical evidence that these languages have evolved when deaf people have come together as communities. We can look, if we look at the British example, then we can see that probably this happens when we had the first formal deaf education in the UK, and that happened about 250 or 300 years ago. A common theme that's been mentioned this evening, people often think that sign languages have no grammar. Sign language doesn't mark gender, just to say, so perhaps we are barbarians as well. People often think that British Sign Language is maybe just English on the hands. Now, of course, as a minority language, we have some borrowings from English. So we have something which is called finger spelling, where we represent manual letters on our hands, and we borrow some words from English, but that's not the only thing that we do. So now I'll tell you some of the truths about sign languages. There are many different sign languages across the globe. And as with spoken languages, we tend to see families of sign languages distributed across the globe. And often those sign language families, the genetic families of languages, don't mirror what's happening in spoken languages at all. Sign languages are just as conventionalized as spoken languages. They have morphological rules, phonological rules. And they have evolved from naturally occurring deaf communities to develop a complex grammar. Similarly, their complex grammars are not related to the spoken languages that we see, often where those languages are used. And of course, there's variations within different sign languages as to their grammatical rules. If we look at the British situation, there's an estimated 50 to 70,000 British Sign Language users, deaf people using sign language in the UK. And in that language family within which BSL resides, we can probably see Australian Sign Language, New Zealand Sign Language, Maltese Sign Language, some dialects of some varieties of South African Sign Language, and also Indian Sign Language as well. Interestingly enough, American Sign Language and Irish Sign Language are not related to British Sign Language. They fall within the same language family as LSF, French Sign Language, even though the spoken language of those communities are English. Deaf schools were established in because of the deaf schools that were established and the deaf educators that were involved in those schools, we see different language families emerging. We have some records of British Sign Language which date back to the 16th century, and from those pictures we can see that there are definitely some things, some signs which we still see in evidence today. But obviously without a written literature, our languages have been lower status than many spoken languages that have a written literature, and of course we have no record of what sign language looked like predating the 16th century. We have some evidence from authors that sign languages were used within Mediterranean societies, probably from around the 5th century BC. We have a variety of Greek philosophers, as named here, Herodotus, Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato, who discussed the use of gestures and languages by deaf people, whether people who didn't have speech had language or not, and were trying to understand whether they had mental capacity to be humans or not. We also have some Jewish and Roman philosophers who speculated on the nature of deaf existence, what their place was in society, and often this hinged around whether deaf people had inheritance rights, what their legal situation within those societies were, whether they could give evidence in court, and how that would happen. We have some discussion in the Mishnah, and that's been mentioned already this evening, looking at the legal status of signing, and it discusses that a deaf mute may communicate by signs and be communicated with by signs. So it does seem to also suggest that deaf individuals could be married to other people and other deaf individuals as well. Fast forwarding quite considerably, as we don't have much time to discuss much of the evidence there is, if we move to the 17th century, rather an important event that happened in London, the Great Fire in 1666. One of the famous diarists, Samuel Pepys, mentions that Downing had a deaf servant who was describing that there was some event happening, that the fire was going on, and they were using some kind of rudimentary signs, as we can see noted here on the slide. I'll move on to the next slide if people have had a chance to read that. Yeah, okay. So as I've said before, sign languages have traditionally had lower statuses than spoken languages, not just because of the gender issue, but because of a variety of other things too. People have generally seen sign languages as gestural and not full languages, as we see from the Bloomfield quote here. And that this gestural element has meant that the gestures were not immediately intelligible gestures, and they were based on the convention of ordinary speech. In terms of the social context of BSL, it's a minority language used by a community which has historically had low status. As Aristotle said, if you can't hear, you can't think. And if a person who can't use speech can't think. So we can see from that classical philosophy we've had a lower status imbued on us. One of the things that's curious about the deaf community is that there's non-traditional transmission patterns of the language. Many people who are born deaf aren't born to deaf parents. And obviously there aren't that many people who use sign language within the community. Because there's no standard use of sign language, we see lots of lexical variation within geographical regions. And because of the status of English and the status of education, deaf people are generally bilingual. So they will be able to read and write the local language. And often more value is put on literacy and also potentially being able to speak the majority language within which they find themselves. There has historically been the banning of use of sign language, and that's been more successful in some countries than others. One event that's often cited is a conference that happened in 1880 in Milan, where deaf educators voted to ban the use of sign languages, and from that moment, many of the deaf staff and deaf teachers who worked in schools across Europe were then fired, so that they could use what was called an oral method, trying to get deaf children to use speech. And we've seen that happening again and again throughout the history of deaf people. So I'll talk a little over the deaf community itself as a minority cultural and linguistic group. As with any language group, we have our own cultures and traditions. We have an oral storytelling tradition, stories that are passed on from generation to generation. I'll give you an example of one story that I can remember I was told when I was small. I grew up in Melbourne in Australia. And at that point, people were not always allowed to drive. And so the myth story of how we were enabled to drive was that one of the politicians had a limousine and was going to lunch. And he saw a police commissioner walking on the street and wanted to offer him a lift, offer him a ride. And the police commissioner said, "Wow, this driver is really very good. Of this, your chauffeur's excellent." And the person said, "Oh, well, he's deaf." And so this is how deaf people are then able to get our driving licenses. But it's, I mean, that's a more recent story, but it's stories about that in relation to deaf people demonstrating to the wider community their abilities. I'm not sure how truthful that story is, but it's definitely one that's valued within our community. We also are used to experiencing the world with our eyes. So we have lots of visual humour. And we would describe ourselves as having a minority status. We have a large transnational community as well. Deaf people from different countries have similar experiences. We have different experiences too as well. We may read and write different languages, we sign different languages, but as deaf people who are minority status people within majority contexts, we often have shared experiences that we want to share amongst each other. And when we see, even though we see two different sign languages, we're better able to communicate with each other than people who have two different spoken languages. We can use the iconic nature of sign language to be able to have rudimentary conversations and form bonds in a transnational manner. I thought it might be interesting to show some of our literature. So here's an example of sign language poetry. We have art forms within our community that, of course, traditionally haven't been able to be recorded. I'll let you view this poem and then I'll give you a summary of it, but I'll encourage you to watch carefully. This is the sense of touch. Taste. the sense of smell. So he's saying that he's not there, that sense. And this is the sense of sight. And so he works with sound. That's what the poem's about, the five senses. So that's the visual metaphor to show how deaf people see themselves and experience the world, and don't necessarily see themselves as missing something. I thought before I finished I would mention a variety of the things that have happened about sign language in the theatre and in film. Louise Fletcher actually used American Sign Language when she was collecting her Oscar. Her parents were deaf, so she wanted to thank her parents in sign language when she received the Oscar. She didn't sign in the film. You probably remember Nurse Ratched in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So she didn't sign in the film, but when she received her Oscar, she has American Sign Language as her first language and wanted to thank her parents in that language. And then the first deaf person to win an Oscar was Marley Matlin in 1987 for Children of a Lesser God. And that was a very big advance from Johnny Belinda. Jane Wyman won the Oscar, but she was a hearing person who was acting a deaf role. So it was at that point perhaps thought that deaf people weren't good enough to be able to use sign language in the film, but for 1987 for us was globally was seen as very positive. In the UK, sign language has appeared on television for many years. If you grew up here, and I remember this being broadcast in Australia as well, Vision On had sign language in the 1960s and 70s. We also have the longest running television magazine programme for the deaf in the world called See Here, based on BBC Two and has been going since 1981. Clive Mason is still a presenter, and when I do my little advert for British Sign Language at UCL, he's the one who's going to be teaching it, just in case you're starstruck. We even have examples of royal patronage, which is important to some people and less important to others, of course. But we know that the royal family likes to inbreed somewhat across Europe. So there's lots of genetic conditions that pass through the variety of generations. Queen Alexandra, queen of King Edward VII, could sign. There was a deaf church which was based where Selfridge is now, St Saviour's Church, on Oxford Street. And she used to attend that church occasionally and participate in the church service using sign language. And she's not the only deaf royal person. There is a long history of deafness within royal families. Prince Philip's mother was deaf as well. And Princess Diana was the patron of the British Deaf Association. And she launched the British Sign Language Dictionary in 1992 using British Sign Language. And deaf people still talk about, if you recognise a deaf person in the street and you're talking to deaf people, they talk about these stories still. So it's still interesting in terms of a little bit of community awareness, can be very useful. So now to a little bit of an advert for BSL at UCL. We know that diversity is valued in UCL as a community, and there are a variety of things to do with different aspects of deaf people's lives and BSL, which are researched here. Next semester, British Sign Language will be an option for modern languages at the UCL Language Centre. So students here will be able to learn British Sign Language. So there we are. It's often been a hard challenge for people to take British Sign Language in schools or universities because it has no written form. That's the argument that's used. And similarly, that it's not a foreign language, although we know now that Welsh is offered as a modern language option, so those arguments are losing traction, fortunately. So if you are interested in learning BSL, do go to UCL Language Centre. Their website and enroll. But in terms of thinking about the future, which is one of the questions we were asked to consider, what does the future hold for us? At the moment, there is an attrition of deaf schools, which has been the traditional arenas where sign language has thrived. More and more deaf children are mainstreamed. And so it's much more challenging for hearing parents of deaf children to enable their children to be put in an environment where they can thrive as a language user. There's more technology to enable deaf children to have access to written forms of English through captioning, live subtitling, and of course technology in the terms of cochlear implants. The deaf community is a bilingual community, and of course one of the problems about being a bilingual community is that sometimes the less useful it is to use the lower status language that you have. At the same time, we have a UN Convention on the Rights for People with Disability, and sign language is mentioned in 5 of the articles in terms of ensuring that sign language is provided in education and services are provided to deaf and deafblind people. Another area of interest for many sign language researchers is language contact. My PhD actually looked at contact between different dialects of BSL with different dialects of Irish Sign Language across the globe to see how deaf people who were bilingual in 2 sign languages and had that contact, what happened in those situations. But we definitely have challenges also in terms of genetic counselling. It's possible to recognise genes which cause deafness. I'm deaf, and from deaf parents, it's probable that I have a deaf gene, which means if you're wanting to get rid of those genes, then by having no deaf communities, you will no longer have communities that will use sign languages. I went to one meeting with a genetic researcher at quite a world-famous university called UCL. And that researcher was talking about genetic planning, and how this person felt that really deaf people shouldn't be able to pick a deaf embryo if they're wanting to have a child because of the terrible legacy they would be giving that children. But my mother, who was deaf, chose my father, who was deaf, and had me, who was deaf. And that woman said, "Oh, I really can't understand that." Why somebody would marry somebody that they loved and have a child, who knew? But it's shocking to see that you have that kind of language and cultural group, and you have other discourses within a genetics field putting pressure on those language communities. So, I mean, to summarise, I would say that probably the deaf community's been around for a hell of a long time. We've survived many pressures. There are modern challenges, and hopefully I've given you a short snapshot of British Sign Language and the deaf communities within the British Isles. Thank you very much for allowing me to